Playhouse Square or something like that. Think about that. Think about the manager or the owner that has to take care of that. Now imagine that this owner is having to book these big names, and he wants to draw crowds into his concert hall, because that's the whole point of the thing, is to bring income in. Well, he does this, and he does it well, and he has good names coming in year after year, and he has a great reputation of having the best names at his concert hall. So people come from all around to come to this concert hall. Well, after a while, he notices that there are some interesting individuals, musicians, that start to gather outside of the hall. And these individuals are just kind of busking and doing their own type of music. It's kind of a classical, ragtime, oldies, pop music, just this compilation of different music. And so it's not a real refined music, but yet it is still interesting. And he sees this, and it's not a problem for him. They get $1 here and there tossed to him, but eventually these guys that are outside his hall start to attract more and more people. And it becomes so popular, in fact, that he notices that his attendance in ticket sales are dwindling. They're dropping. And the crowds are getting bigger and bigger outside the hall, but nobody's coming into the hall instead. And it becomes a problem for him because he's lost all of this sale. Now, these guys are releasing their own album. Their names are starting to become popular, and they're not part of the hall. And so we have this kind of idea. I spoke last week a little bit about the Sadducees, who were the ones who controlled the temple. They were the ones who had the monopoly on the priesthood, and they weren't liked by anyone other than other Sadducees or other priests. And so in this way, they had controlled. What we're going to find today is they have this envy that builds up. And so think about this story, about what it represents and why they might have had some of this envy. Because the priesthood had always been about them. The title I'm giving for today is Strife in Jerusalem, because we have this as a theme throughout these 4 chapters that we're going to examine in brevity. But Luke has, as a pattern, he makes summaries. He'll tell a story. He introduces the book of Acts, tells a story, then he gives a summary of what's happened. Then he moves to his next story. Then he gives another summary, and so on and so forth. So up to this point, we've had one summary, and that summary is in chapter 2 we went through. And in this summary, he says things like they were devoted to the apostles' teaching. Awe was on everyone because of all the miracles and the signs and wonders that were happening. Everyone was filled with awe. They had all things in common, we read. All things were, the needs that were there were being met, and they were sharing with one another. They spent a lot of time together. We found out this was on the Temple Mount and at home, it says. And they all had generous hearts, and they were praising God. And the numbers, it says, were continuing to increase. So more and more people were being drawn to this. And you'll notice a theme today especially is that while this persecution is also starting to increase, with this persecution, the numbers are increasing as well. And that seems kind of odd to me, doesn't it you? It seems it would be the opposite, that if there's persecution, you'd want to go away from that type of thing. So that's the first summary. And then we have more story, which we spoke about. But then he gives another summary, and this is in today's text. The text that we're covering today is chapter 4, verse 32, because we ended at verse 31, because of where the story begins and ends. So chapter 4, verse 32, through chapter 8, verse 3. Now, there's another summary that's given here in chapter 4, verse 32 through verses 35. And this introduces us to an individual named Joseph, and surname is Barnabas, so mostly we call him Barnabas usually. And it kind of fills us in as to the role that he's going to play in the next 11 chapters. We find that the heart and soul of the multitude of believers, it says, it was all one soul, or another way of saying it, they had all things in common. Now, this all things in common, this is a Greek proverb and was well known. It related to friendship and mutual connection. This idea of all believers being one is also found in the Gospel of John when Jesus is praying about his disciples and his followers. In John chapter 17, he said that they may all be one, the same as we are one. So this idea of communion and commonality is a very popular theme, especially within the Jesus movement. So they are all one. they continue to speak of the resurrection. The theme of Jesus' resurrection is very dynamic in this time. The needs, again, it says, the needs of these people that were there were being met. In the proceeds of generosity, which comes into our first story, were being laid at the apostles' feet. So these believers, this community, were bringing funds and other things and laying them at the apostles' feet in order to be distributed to those who were in need. So that is the summary that leads us into the first part of this story in this body of text. So I'm calling it the scene one, the Ananias and Sapphira story. And I know you all know it, so I'm not going to cover it in detail, but I think there's some amazing things that we can pick out of the story. So the story begins with a Levite. Now remember, the Levites were the priests. So they were the ones who served in the temple. Now keep that in your mind as you think about what we talked about last week with the Sadducees and the authority that they wielded, the power that they had over the people, what they were allowed to do, beating people, and the maltreatment that they gave towards people. So think about Joseph Barnabas being a priest in this. Joseph had a field, and he sold it, and he laid the money at the apostles' feet. Now, Ananias and Sapphira also did that. They sold something, a piece of property probably, and they brought only part of it, though, and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now, notice the word feet here is being emphasized. So they come, and Peter decides to confront Ananias. How Peter knew exactly, we're not entirely sure, but Peter confronts Ananias and said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Spirit of God in keeping back part of the proceeds that you've made? Now, remember, up to this point, we're looking at an early community that is thriving and is in some ways a very idealistic setting. It's meant to be emulated in certain ways to say, wow, this is what the community of God is supposed to look like. Sharing all things, having all these things. But Luke wants to point out at this point, remember that they still were not without sin. Satan can still, even as Satan has corrupted and filled the hearts of the Sadducees with corruption, also others are able to be the wicked agents of Satan as well. So nobody is immune from that. It's the power of God that keeps us within his grasp. So Peter continues, the land that you had and the money that you made from that, wasn't it yours? It was all yours to do with it what you pleased. You have not lied to mortals. You've not lied to us, Ananias. You've lied to God. And at that moment, Ananias was struck. Now, remember, Ananias was not struck by Peter. Everyone who saw it, witnessed it, or everyone who witnessed it was struck with terror. Well, you can imagine why. Look at what just happened. In the same way, up to this point in the story, Peter had, in the last chapter, had just healed a man at the temple. Remember that? The lame man who was walking and leaping and praising God because of the power that had been done through Peter's words. Rise up and walk. In the same way that Peter's words were able to heal and bring healing to this community, so they can also bring judgment from God whenever they're on the other side. But it does come from God. Again, this is not Peter that is inciting this. This is God. It's God's power at work. So in come the young people. The young people come and they take him to be buried. Then 3 hours later, Sapphira, his wife, who seemed to be completely unaware of what had transpired, she shows up. And so Peter questions her as well. And he says, did you sell the land? Did you sell for X amount for so much? And she said, yeah, that's the correct amount. And Peter says, how is it? Why have you both agreed to challenge the Spirit of God? Why have you done this? Did you think that God would be unaware of what has happened? And the feet of those, Peter said, who have buried your husband are on their way here to take you. And so with this setting, you have Ananias falling down at the feet of Peter. And then the feet of those who are coming in to pick up Sapphira, who fell down at the feet of the apostles. So before you have the gifts being laid at the apostles' feet, disobedience happens and the challenging of the Spirit of God, and you have them falling down at the feet of the apostle. So terror and dread, you can imagine, came upon the entire community in the community in Jerusalem. The deception that happened was in pretending that they were contributing everything while they were keeping some for themselves. There wasn't a problem keeping some for themselves. The difficulty, the wrong was in the deception, as though they were going to look as though they were giving all, and yet they were only giving some. Now this story actually has multiple components, like I've tried to point out many times, how Luke's style is that he takes earlier stories from the Old Testament, Israel's heritage, and he incorporates them into his story in different ways. So in this story, we have the Achan story. You remember, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but in Joshua chapter 7, Achan, they were all taking part in taking down Jericho, and they were specifically told to not take those things for themselves. But Achan does anyways. He hides it, and he comes under the condemnation of God because literally he stole what was God's. That was not for him. So you have that story at work there, kind of as a background. You also have the story of Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, in Leviticus chapter 10. And if you remember that story, they were doing something against that which was classified as being holy. And what they offered was unauthorized incense offerings, they were called. And so in that text we're told that fire came from the presence of the Lord and devoured them. And 2 Chronicles chapter 26, King Uzziah is infringing on the sanctuary, and he's struck down with leprosy. So the point that we can take away from this story is to not tamper with the things that are classified as holy, or that God classifies as holy. In this case, in our story, this is not a matter of sacred ground. We're not talking about doing something wrong to something in the temple, for instance. We're talking about a place where everything is holy, that everything that is God's. So if abused, if the things that God has classified as sacred, in this sense, his spirit going into this body of believers and them taking care of each other, this is something that's holy. And Ananias and Sapphira have abused this. So if abused, this holiness can become a power of destruction rather than, as we have seen so far, salvation for everyone, those who are being saved. So it's a power that can be wielded both ways. God is not going to allow his ground to be tampered with. Then we come to another summary. This summary is in chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. In this summary, Luke tells us that signs and wonders were done through the apostles. So he's continuing to keep us on this theme of the signs and wonders being done through the apostles. And so again, he tells us, like he's told us before, that together they were all in one place in Solomon's portico. And what's interesting about his mentioning of them being in Solomon's portico, which is right on the Temple Mount, if you remember the picture I had up there for you, Luke is highlighting the fact that this new Jesus movement is not at odds with the temple. They're dwelling together in unity with the temple at this time. It's not a conflict of interest. It is with the Sadducees, but they have been bad representatives of what the temple actually stands for. No outsiders dared venture too close, Luke tells us in his summary here. But he says that the general public, however, did praise them. And so because of this, more people, he says, continued to be added. So even amidst this event that terrorized the church, terrorized this community, this Jerusalem community, still more people came in. Because it's amazing what happens when you have a very blatant working of power in that sense. So then we come to scene 2. Luke tells a story, summary, tells a story, another summary. So now we come to this next scene where the apostles are arrested. Now, the high priest and his colleagues, we'll call them the Sadducees, they were filled with envy. Remember the story I told you. This is what's happening. This small band of Jesus followers are starting to attract more and more and more people, and they're right here on our front doorstep. And they're the ones attracting people, not us. So they're filled with envy, and so they decided to take action. So what do you do when somebody does something that you don't like? Well, naturally, you put them in prison. So they took and they put the apostles in prison, but not for long. The angel of the Lord came, opens the doors, and escorts them out. And the angel said, "Get in the temple and continue to preach this message of life some more. Don't stop preaching. Keep going." Okay, so off they go. At dawn, there they were in the temple, continuing to preach the resurrection. So in the morning, and we had this story last time as well, that they didn't want to convene a council at night. That was a special occasion just for Jesus, because Jesus was just that bad of a criminal. So they convened at night. This time, no, they can stay in prison all night. We'll convene in the morning. So they convened the council in the morning, and so they sent for their prisoners. But the temple police get there, and they're gone. Now, in the text itself, this is meant to be a comedic sort of relief. It's a comedy section. He puts this in here for fun because the Sadducees, they put them in jail. Where do you expect your guys to stay? You expect to keep them in jail. You don't expect them to walk out of jail. Not only that, but the prison was still secure. The guards were still there, but nobody was inside. This is just, it's funny. And this is the first of three prison miracles that we'll find in Acts. So naturally, the captain and the leading priests, they couldn't figure out what had happened and what to make of it. A further irony is, I told you before that the Sadducees, the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, a few of the differences at least, was one, that they didn't believe in resurrection. So why does Luke keep referring back to the resurrection? Well, because the Sadducees don't believe in it. Well, what happens when a guy resurrects from the dead? Well, it's pretty hard not to believe in it anymore. And so that's why they wanted to keep it quiet. It's pretty hard to keep your belief system when somebody's contradicting it by rising from the dead. Well, another thing that the Sadducees didn't believe in were angels. So the comic irony of this whole story is that their plan is thwarted by an angel or a being in which they didn't believe. So it's very funny when you look at it that way. So, and also what it shows is where God stands. Where does the Almighty stand on this matter? This dispute that's happening between those who are supposed to represent him, the Sadducees, and those who are actually representing him, the apostles. Where does God stand on this? Well, the apostles get locked in prison. Who lets them out? God. So this story is saying God's on this side. So God's message cannot be shackled. And I think that's one thing that we can take right into our own day. That when God puts something in our hearts, when God puts a message, no matter what happens, that message will not be shackled because God will be with it if it originates from him. So someone told the high priest, that the apostles were in the temple teaching. Oh, for the love of Pete. Really? They're back there again. So the police had to go back, get the disciples. This time they didn't do it with violence because they were afraid of the people and from getting stoned. So the leading priests questioned them again and say, "Didn't we tell you not to preach this garbage? You filled the entirety of Jerusalem with your nonsense, your heresy. You're also trying to pin this guy's death on us, and we don't like it. So stop it." Peter says, we have to obey God rather than human authority. Peter doesn't deny that they are authorities. They are authorities. God had put them in charge. But yet, Peter is listening at this point to a higher authority. The God of our ancestors, Peter continues, God raised him from the dead. So again, Peter's just pushing it right in their face. God raised him from the dead. Oh, we don't believe in that. And you hung him on a tree. Peter's way of saying, yeah, we're going to pin it on you because you're responsible for what had happened. God exalted him, Peter says. And God is giving, through him, Israel the opportunity to amend our ways and to find forgiveness. And we are witnesses to these matters. So we cannot stop proclaiming this message that God has burned within our hearts. Now at this time, there was a member of the council who was a Pharisee, a very well-revered man named Gamaliel. He takes the floor and he sends the apostles out so they can deliberate regarding this whole scene. And he stands up and he says, "Fellow Israelites, my brothers, think really carefully what you propose to do regarding this problem. Let me remind you that Theudas rose up and he claimed to be somebody great. He gathered 400 people to him and he was eliminated and his movement was disbanded. Another one," Gamaliel goes on, "Judas of Galilee, remember him? He also led a pack of rebels, had many that were following him, but they also perished and their movement was destroyed as well. So, my advice to you, counsel, keep away from them. Because if this scheme is of human origins, it will fail. But if it's of God, if it's divinely inspired and driven, you're not going to overthrow it. And even so, you will be found to be fighting against God. And be really, really careful to not pick a fight with God. You'll usually find yourself on the losing end of that one. And that kind of takes us back mentally to our story of Ananias and Sapphira. God does know and will act accordingly. So the apostles are beat and released. The Torah specified that they were allowed 39 lashes, 40 minus 1. And they're commanded, again, not that it was going to help, to not preach or teach in this name of Jesus. They suffer, in Luke's story, the same punishment that Pilate had proposed to give to Jesus. When they're going, they're rejoicing. They're rejoicing that they were counted worthy because it was an honor for them, and they kept proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, as the chosen, as the anointed of God. And they did so at the temple, and they did so at houses. In this story, Gamaliel, this Pharisee, this high revered Pharisee, saved their life. Because of the accusation that was brought against them, they were able to be executed for this charge. And actually, in the story, not in the Acts story, but in the gospel story, there were Pharisees that saved Jesus' life as well. So don't always think of Pharisees as being the enemies, because they represented a wide, different belief system, even as Christianity does today. So this story illustrates that the common people loved the Jesus followers. This is a reality. But the leaders were the ones that specifically hated them. A theme I think that we can take away from this particular story, is that if we are on God's side, if we are carrying the message that God puts within our hearts, even the most powerful entities in the world can do nothing in opposition to it. Remember the gospel stories. Jesus, our rabbi, our teacher, our leader, our Lord, walks on water. Prisons cannot keep us in. The gates of hell cannot keep us out. Even death itself will not keep us down. We come to the scene number 3, in the choosing of the 7. So in those days, the disciples, again, Luke tells us, were increasing in number. More and more were continuing to be added. There arose a conflict between two groups called the Hebrews and the Hellenists. Now, I wish I could go into more detail with you about who these groups were and what they represented, but I don't have near the time. So just suffice it to say that these were two groups of people that didn't get along with each other or see each other quite eye to eye. Maybe in the same way that today groups like what we would classify loosely as conservatives and liberals don't tend to see eye to eye on different opinions. So you have the Hellenists, which were more Greek-oriented people, spoke Greek, and were more minded towards the modern type living, and you have the Hebrews, who were more traditionalists. So you have these two groups. But within this group, you have the widows, Luke tells us, that were being neglected. The Hellenists' widows were being neglected. Now, it could be that this was happening because the Hellenists, and what they believed, the Hebrews didn't want anything to do with them, this specific group. But either way, widows are one of the lowest classes of people, because a widow is somebody who's lost her husband and has lost pretty much all way of income. So she really has no means to provide for herself. So this is, in Luke's way of telling it, this is to give you This is to make you feel sorry for these widows very badly, because these are the ones that the Torah continues to say, that their law, their Bible would say, you need to take care of the widows and the orphans. That's who God cares about immensely. So those are the ones who are being neglected. What we find in this opening scene are a couple things I want to highlight, because I think it has tremendous relevance to our own day. And that is that as we're moving into this community that's changing and meeting the difficulties of the time, and we see this conflict arise, they have to address the issues. They have to work through these difficulties. They have to find a way to make it work. Now, I know that there's no such thing as conflict in today's Christianity. We all dwell together in complete unity, and there's no schisms or anything. We've come past that, I understand. But just humor me. Pretend that there were fighting today. Is there a way to look past some things that we tend to think are more important than they are? Sometimes the conflict that brews in us is maybe not worth the fight itself. Remember something that was taught by Jesus himself, and that was love in the community of God. The disciples, we are told, were going to be known first and foremost as Jesus' disciples by the love that they exhibited for one another. That was going to be the identifier. Nothing else, not their doctrine, not their pet peeve issues, the love that they had for each other amidst difficulties that would most certainly arise. Even in Jesus' tight-knit 12 group, in his tight little community of 12 followers, he had a tax collector and zealots. Now, if you remember anything about history in the Bible time, you know that zealots and tax collectors hated each other. They were trying to kill each other. Well, the zealots more so the tax collectors, but either way. So within Jesus' community, in his 12 followers, he's able to pull together two polar opposite type of people and make it work, because they had those things in common. So in the same way, a lot of Christians can find themselves fighting over things that are not necessarily important issues. Remember who you follow. In bearing one another's burdens, this is an important aspect in today's world. We live in a day of trauma and drama and hurt, and this is something that I have had to, in the last few months, on a personal note, in the last few months of my life has probably been the most difficult of my entire life. I've had to deal with more death and trauma and things happening within family, and just an immense amount of hurt just being dumped on time after time. If we as the community of God are not able to come in and to help offset that hurt, it could destroy us. And that's really what the community was for, was to say, we see you hurting, we're going to offset that because we want you to be able to make it through this. We do not want this to destroy you. So that's what the community is for. That's what bearing one another's burdens is all about, is to be able to come alongside. It's not that the hurt's going to go away. It's going to continue to be there. But to try to do it alone always can be your undoing. So with family and friends and support of those around who love me, it's been a tremendous help to get through these things. Luke, in the book of Luke, in the book of Acts, Luke composes these stories in part to try and bring and reinforce peace to brethren who are at war with one another. So the 12 apostles called a meeting of disciples. They get together after this conflict that arose between the Hellenists and the Hebrews, and they said, we can't neglect the proclamation of God's message. God has put this message on our hearts, and it's not that serving tables or providing for the widows was a lesser task that they said, no, we can't stoop to this level. That's not what's happening here at all. What they're saying is, God has given us a specific task. We want to make sure that these are not overlooked. So what they did is they chose They said, we need to choose 7 men of good standing that are full of faith and wisdom, which 7 in the Hebrew Bible is a symbolic number, as it is in the Greek world too, is a symbolic number. So they found 7 men that were full of faith and wisdom and of the Spirit, and they laid hands on them. This is in a practice that goes even all the way back to Moses. The laying on of hands, a type of ordination, transfer of authority. It's an ancient tradition. We find that same thing happening in Exodus chapter 18, the delegation of authority, where Moses can't do it alone. And Jethro, his father-in-law, says, Moses, this is going to destroy you. You've got to get some help. And so Moses finds others who are of good report, that are known among the people, and he sets them over 50s and 100s and so on. So Moses does the same thing. And so that's why we see this in this story. So they're delegating the responsibility. So the message, therefore, continued to spread, and the number of followers, Luke tells us again, continues to increase. Even, he gives us a specific detail, that a number of priests began to embrace the faith. Now, with everything we've spoken about priests, think about how the Gospel of Luke starts out. Remember, it starts out with the story of John the Baptist and John the Baptist's father, Zechariah. And it tells us that Zechariah and Elizabeth, Zechariah was one of the priests, it tells us that he was a righteous priest. Now that kind of may not strike you, but it's the same way as if somebody in today would say something like, well, yeah, our pastor is a Christian. It kind of goes without saying that you would have a righteous priest. The priests are supposed to be righteous. But why he says this is because there's so much corruption at Luke's time that he specifies that this priest is actually a righteous one. That's why he says it. And so in the same way, we have Joseph Barnabas, who's also this righteous priest. And Luke tells us that a number of these priests began to embrace Jesus, the high calling, the highest calling, embrace the faith as it was meant, as God is revealing it to his people. God pouring his message through his disciples, they say, yes, we are on board with this. Then we come to scene 4, Stephen's witness. Now the word witness is the word where the word martyr comes from. So keep that in mind with this story. This is in chapter 6, verse 8 through chapter 8, verse 3. So Stephen, we're told, is a powerful man, and he worked signs and wonders. Well, you wouldn't expect any less, would you? Again, opposition arose. And false allegations are being brought against Stephen, that he's speaking out against Moses in the temple, which is actually the same charges that were brought against Jesus, Mark tells us in chapter 14 and chapter 15. And John chapter 2 also tells us about these allegations that are brought against Jesus not being true. In the story that we have of Stephen, Luke does the same thing he did before. He's got an older story at work. Do you remember the story in 1 Kings chapter 21 of Naboth? Naboth in the vineyard? Remember, Naboth has this vineyard that's very delightful, and Ahab wants it. So what happens? Jezebel sets up false witnesses to accuse Naboth that he had cursed God and the king. Okay? And the story ends with Naboth being stoned. That's the same thing that happens with our Stephen story. So you have another story working within this one. So these charges disturbed the public, and the leaders, the Sadducees, the high rulers, they abducted Stephen, and they also brought him to the council. Well, it's time for another council. So at this time, the false witnesses are set up, and they charged him with speaking out against the law, against the Torah, against God. And they said that this man says that he was going to destroy the temple and alter the practices that Moses had given us. And then the text says something very interesting, and I always wondered what this was all about. That it says that his face was as radiant as an angel. And they looked upon his face, and they saw like the face of an angel. Now, there's many examples of the reflection in someone's face being a reflection of the glory of God. It also, through the Hebrew Bible, through the Old Testament, is a sign of authenticity and spiritual power that is within a certain message. So it leaves you this his face as the face of an angel, it leaves us with the implication that he speaks for God, particularly right now he speaks for God in front of this council, as Moses had also done. Not in front of the council, but speaking for the people. This idea is actually even attested in rabbinic stories, in rabbinic literature. I'm going to read you one just for the sake of it being interesting. There was a rabbi named Eliezer, and his writings were recorded, but this is what it says. Then Eliezer sat down and expounded, meaning expounded the text. His face shone like the light of the sun, and his radiance beamed like that of Moses, so that no one knew whether it was day or night. So this is a usual phenomenon known well in their community. What Luke wants you to know is that he's sitting there, get ready. What he's going to say is God's message. So this speech that he gives us, this long story, 70 verses it goes on for. So I'm not going to read them. You're welcome. And this speech is a tradition that was well known in Israel, that they would retell the story of their heritage. They would retell it. Examples are Nehemiah. Nehemiah did this in chapter 9 of the book of Nehemiah. There's a book called Jubilees, which is an older book that the Hebrews had. It's a retelling of the story. Enoch, which is the book of Enoch, it's called a pseudepigraphic type of piece of literature. It was written by Jews as well. It has a retelling of the story. Jesus actually does this very thing in Luke chapter 24. Remember the disciples that are on the road to Emmaus? And then this unknown stranger comes alongside them, and he begins to tell them who he was, and he begins with Moses and goes all the way up through. So Jesus does the exact same thing. And you'll find through this story of Stephen that Stephen does so many things the same way Jesus does. And this is Luke's way of telling you that Stephen is just like his rabbi. Stephen is just like Jesus. And that's exactly what the whole point is. So he goes through this, and this is a vital thing to recognize, because we find out what it is that Stephen is trying to highlight in his retelling of the story, because in this way, the things that he leaves out, or the things that he adds in, or the things that he concentrates on, those are the things that highlight what his point is. And so we'll find a couple of those. So what he does is he highlights that rejection. He brings this out, that rejection of the leaders throughout Israel's history, the rejection of the leaders that God sends is a very Israelite thing to do, it turns out. And so Stephen uses this in his argument. This is really brilliant, by the way. Stephen uses this in his argument because he says, you know how I know that Jesus is the sent one? You know how I know that God's behind him? Because you guys rejected him and killed him. That's how I know that Jesus, you've always killed the ones who God sends. And so they're like, good. So he uses this to argue for Jesus' legitimate status. Then he starts with Abraham. And he says that God worked, beginning with Abraham and his family. Remember, we're a people on the move. Don't forget that. God is continuing to move with us. We have to move when God moves. That's the point. Point one. Right? It's all about the journey, Stephen says. The next segment, he says, God worked through Joseph. And Joseph had a lot of opposition. And this is actually a good one that he brings out, because Joseph was an example also of a righteous sufferer. Remember, Jesus is the one who suffered as a righteous sufferer. We saw him using Isaiah over and over again. Joseph was rejected by his own people, but God reversed it. God exalted him and used Joseph to bring salvation to those who had rejected him. Does that sound like another story? Well, that's what Stephen is tying in. That's what his point is. God worked through Moses. Now, Moses is the one that he spends the most time detailing. Why do you think he might spend the most time with Moses? He's talking to the Sadducees and the priests who didn't believe in the prophets. They didn't believe in resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. But they did believe in Moses. To them, Moses was the most important. We have our Bible. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the Bible. There's nothing further. Closed canon. That's it. That's what they believed. Why do you think Stephen chose to spend so much time on Moses? Because Moses was their hero. That's why he spends time on him. And so Moses also encountered more opposition. He was also rejected by his kinsfolk. And so as God sent Moses to the people, Jesus had also been sent. And pretty soon here, Paul was going to be sent with this new mission, continuing mission. And so he also goes into the next segment, and he's critical of what the temple had become. Not critical of the temple itself necessarily, critical of the corruption that had become part of the temple, as if this is the only legitimate worship of God. Stephen says, no. The worship of God is much larger than this. God doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. You misunderstood the whole time. God is where his people are, and you're the ones who are persecuting them. And so Stephen gives this charge of rebellion. Stephen's point is, you, Sadducees, have been unfaithful to your greatest hero. Your hero? You're not obeying him. You're rejecting him. You have uncircumcised hearts and ears. Where does Stephen take this? He takes this out of the Torah. It's their book. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and Deuteronomy chapter 30. Moses said, circumcise your hearts and ears, Israel. Circumcise the foreskins of your heart. Meaning that it's not just about keeping a legal code. It's about making sure your heart is right before God. And then he says, you've become murderers of Jesus, the righteous one, and you have not kept the law that was delivered to Moses. And this is the kicker that Stephen puts in there. He says, delivered by angels. Remember, the Sadducees don't believe in angels. And so they rejected the law that was delivered to Moses, their hero, by beings they don't believe in. How ironic is that? So they're pretty ticked. The outcome? Well, they rush at him. Stephen gazed into heaven, and he sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God, which is Stephen quoting, this is a quotation out of Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man standing in power and glory, and Psalms 110:1, where David speaking, my Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand, why make your enemies your footstool? Long story short, Stephen is accusing them of being enemies of God. So they take him outside the city, and they stone him. Where was Jesus taken? Outside the city to be killed. Stephen's pattern is following the same as Jesus. And it ends this way. His last words were, do not hold this sin against them. Who said that as they were dying? He dies with the words of Jesus on his lips. Even the way he dies is like Jesus. You think this guy wanted to be like Jesus? You bet he did. Did he succeed? Absolutely. And the world changed because of it. The garments are placed into the hands of a young man named Saul, who was approving of this action. And this is where the Saul-Paul story begins. We're not going there today. I want to leave you with a few themes. Thus far in our story, in our investigation of Acts, we've seen opposition. But growth, because of the opposition, is the outcome. God uses the difficulty that his people go through. There's always going to be difficulty. But God can use these things for his own purpose and to drive the mission that he has for us, to drive those things forward. This is a much bigger story than just you and I. It's going to continue one way or another, with or without us. The question is, do we want to be a part of this story? Sincerity, we'll find, is found everywhere. There are many sincere people. There are people who commit atrocious acts that are as sincere can be. The Sadducees were sincere people. They believed they were doing God's work. Saul believed he was doing God's work. The question is, in our sincerity, are we for or against God? Which side are we on? Are we going to be found fighting against God? We tend to envision that God is like we are. We intend to envision him in our own image. We have certain ideals that govern our lives and our worldview. We have certain causes that are important to us. We have certain politics that we associate with. We have our own forms of nationalism and patriotism. And so sometimes we can get in the idea of thinking that God is a patriotic American who likes a certain type of denomination more than another. What about those who are on the other side of our cause? Does God listen to them? If we go to war with a nation and we're praying that God be with our soldiers, could there be somebody on the other side who is also praying, God be with our soldiers? Does God send people to fight against one another who are both serving Him? And so in that sense, think about your Christian brothers and sisters. Don't think denominationally. Think wider than that. Those who are serving God with their whole heart and mind. Are we fighting and bickering when we are serving God in different ways? But we find in the book of Acts they're serving God in different ways. There are those who are just as fervent in their devotion to God as we are. And they may have a different theological persuasion. They may have a different opinion on politics. They may worship God in different ways. But that doesn't mean that God dislikes them in favor of us. The story is much bigger than that.